There is a moment in almost every serious criminal case where something gets said, quietly, carefully, officially, that changes the entire temperature of the story. Not a theory, not a rumor, not a social media post from someone who has been following the case from their couch. Something on the record. Something from someone who sits at the top of the most powerful law enforcement agency in the world and chooses, deliberately, to say it out loud. That moment happened in the Nancy Guthrie case on May 5th, 2026. And what was said should terrify every single person who has been following this case. Not because it is dramatic language, not because it sounds designed to scare people, but because of what it means, specifically, precisely, and practically, for an 84-year-old woman who has been missing since February 1st, and for the family that has been waiting for answers every single day since. FBI Director Kash Patel went on the Sean Hannity podcast on May 5th, and he said this: "For 4 days after Nancy Guthrie disappeared, the FBI was kept out of the investigation. 4 days, not 4 hours, not a brief miscommunication that got sorted out by the next morning. 4 days. In the very window that the FBI director himself described in those same remarks as the most critical window in any disappearance case. He said it plainly. The first 48 hours of anyone's disappearance are the most critical. For 4 days we were kept out of the investigation, and when we were finally let in, look what we did." That sentence, "look what we did," is the part that most coverage focused on. The pride, the contrast, the suggestion that once the FBI was allowed in, things started moving. And yes, that matters. But the part that should terrify you is not, "look what we did." The part that should terrify you is, "for 4 days we were kept out." Because 4 days in a kidnapping case is not a bureaucratic inconvenience. 4 days in a premeditated abduction of an elderly woman with documented medical vulnerabilities, including a pacemaker and critical medication she cannot survive long without, is not a delay that gets made up later. Those 4 days are gone. Whatever was in them, whatever evidence existed, whatever trail was warm, whatever forensic opportunity was available in the 96 hours after Nancy Guthrie was taken from her home, is part of a history that cannot be revisited. And the director of the FBI is telling you, publicly, on the record, that his agency was not allowed into that window. That is what should terrify everyone. And tonight, we are going to spend the full hour unpacking exactly why. Welcome to Guthrie Records. Subscribe, hit the bell, and drop a comment telling me, when you heard the FBI director say 4 days kept out, what was your first reaction? Because by the time this is over, whatever that first reaction was, you are going to understand it more deeply than you did before. Let's start at the very beginning of the 4-day window. Not February 1st in general terms, February 1st specifically. What was happening in the first hours after Nancy Guthrie disappeared, and why those hours mattered so much? Nancy was last seen by family members on the evening of January 31st, when she spent time at her older daughter Annie's home. She was dropped off at her own residence in the Catalina foothills of Tucson after that visit. Sometime in the early hours of February 1st, around 1:47 a.m. specifically, according to investigative reporting, the doorbell camera at her front door disconnected. That disconnect was not random. It was not a glitch. Investigators would later establish that a masked, armed suspect had approached the front door and appears to have tampered with the camera. The footage that the FBI ultimately released on February 10th, 11 days after the abduction, showed a figure wearing a mask, gloves, a backpack, and a holstered handgun, apparently at the camera. But here is what most people do not fully absorb when they hear that timeline. The doorbell camera disconnecting at 1:47 a.m. was not the moment the case was reported. Nancy's family did not know she was missing until she failed to show up for Sunday church services. The call to authorities came around noon on February 1st, approximately 10 hours after the camera went offline. By the time law enforcement arrived and began working the scene, the suspect had already had a 10-hour head start. 10 hours. In a premeditated kidnapping involving a masked, armed suspect who had apparently been surveilling the property for weeks. 10 hours in which the suspect could have crossed a state line, crossed an international border, changed vehicles, changed clothing, and moved Nancy Guthrie to a location that was not within easy reach of Tucson area law enforcement. That 10-hour gap is not the sheriff's fault. It is the nature of the crime. Nancy did not have a way to alert anyone in real time. Her family could not have known to check on her at 1:47 a.m. The gap is a feature of how this crime was designed and executed. But here's the thing about that 10-hour gap. The one tool that could begin closing it, the one institutional resource with the behavioral analysis capability, the database access, the nationwide network of field offices, and the specific investigative experience to start moving aggressively in the right direction before the trail went cold, was the FBI. And the FBI was not called in immediately. It was called in a meaningful operational sense, 4 days later. So let's be precise about the math. A 10-hour head start for the suspect. And then, by the time the FBI was fully engaged with evidence access, an additional 4 days of investigative time that passed under the primary management of the Pima County Sheriff's Department, an agency that, however well-intentioned, does not have the federal resources, the behavioral analysis units, the forensic laboratory capability, or the nationwide reach of the FBI. By the time the FBI was fully operational in this investigation, the suspect had a head start measured not in hours, but in days. And that is before we even begin to discuss what was happening with the physical evidence during those 4 days. Because the FBI director did not stop at criticizing the timeline. He went further. He specifically called out the handling of physical evidence, the DNA. In his remarks, Patel said, "We would have analyzed it within days." He was talking about the DNA evidence that was recovered at the scene. The biological material that would eventually include blood confirmed to be Nancy's on the front porch, and later the glove found approximately 2 miles away that appeared to match the gloves worn by the suspect in the doorbell footage. We would have analyzed it within days. Think about what that sentence implies. The FBI director is telling you that if his agency had been given access to the physical evidence from the beginning, if the 4-day exclusion had not happened, the DNA processing timeline would have been dramatically compressed. The FBI has laboratory resources that local agencies cannot match. The FBI's crime lab can process evidence in days rather than weeks. And in a kidnapping case where a victim has life-threatening medical needs, the difference between DNA results in days versus DNA results in weeks is not a bureaucratic timeline difference. It is a life or death timeline difference. The FBI's DNA result on the glove, the one that established an unknown male profile that did not match anyone in SOTUS, was not publicly announced until February 17th. That is 16 days after the abduction. If Patel is accurate, and he is speaking as the director of the agency, with access to the case's internal timeline, the implication is that the 4-day exclusion contributed to a DNA processing delay that pushed those results much further down the timeline than they needed to be. And here is why that matters in ways that go far beyond the bureaucratic. In a kidnapping involving ransom, and the Nancy Guthrie case produced ransom-style communications within the first 3 days, with notes sent to media outlets demanding Bitcoin payments, the DNA results and the suspect identification timeline are directly connected to whether a ransom situation can be managed productively. If you know within the first 4 or 5 days that the unknown male DNA on evidence found near the home does not match any known offender in the database, you can begin the next phase of the DNA investigation, the genealogical phase, much earlier. You can engage private labs. You can begin building the family tree from the unknown profile. You can start narrowing the pool of candidates while the public attention and the investigative momentum are at their peak. Instead, that result came on day 16, by which point the ransom deadline had already passed, by which point the public narrative had already cycled through multiple theories, by which point the investigative trail had aged significantly beyond what it was on day 1. That is the downstream cost of 4 days. Not just the 4 days themselves, but the ripple effect, the compounding delay that those 4 days created in every subsequent phase of the investigation. Now, let's talk about why this happened. Because the FBI director saying we were kept out raises an obvious and uncomfortable question. Why would the Pima County Sheriff's Department keep the FBI out of a case this serious, this visible, and this urgent? And the answer, based on the public reporting around this case, is the same answer that appears in almost every high-profile instance of interagency friction in American law enforcement: jurisdiction, authority, and the specific institutional culture that treats a request for federal help not as a sign of good management, but as an admission of inadequacy. Sheriff Chris Nanos leads an elected law enforcement agency. He was voted into office by the residents of Pima County. His authority and his jurisdiction is real, legally grounded, and personally significant to a man who has built his career in that office. When a serious crime occurs in Pima County, it is his case, not because he chose to claim it, because that is how American law enforcement is structured. The FBI does not automatically have primary jurisdiction in a local missing persons case, even when it should, even when the resources of the federal agency are clearly superior, even when every practical consideration points toward federal involvement. The local agency retains authority unless specific federal triggers are met, such as evidence that the victim has been transported across state lines. In the early hours of the Nancy Guthrie case, before any evidence existed of interstate transport, the Pima County Sheriff's Department was the primary agency, and the FBI's role, as Patel himself described it, was to approach the local agency and say, "We are here to help. What do you need?" And for 4 days, according to the FBI director, the answer to that offer was functionally not yet. Now, Sheriff Nanos disputed this characterization. He released a statement after Patel's remarks saying he was committed to the investigation and emphasized ongoing collaboration with the FBI. He said his department had engaged the FBI the very night Nancy disappeared. The specific dispute between the two agencies is about what engaged means versus what full operational access means. And that distinction, invisible to the public in real time, is precisely the difference that the FBI director says cost the investigation critical time. Because there is a difference between the FBI being notified that a case is happening and the FBI being given full access to the physical evidence, the crime scene, and the investigative direction. You can notify the FBI on day one while still restricting what they can touch, what they can process, and what decisions they can influence. And if that restriction lasted 4 days, if the FBI was informed but not empowered for 4 days, then the operational impact is exactly what Patel described. Let's go deeper into what the FBI actually accomplished when it was finally let in. Because the director's statement, "Look what we did," is not empty bravado. It is a reference to specific documented investigative breakthroughs that the FBI produced once it had operational engagement with the case. The doorbell camera footage, the image of the masked, armed suspect at Nancy Guthrie's front door, the single most important visual evidence in this entire case, the image that went viral, that Savannah Guthrie shared on Instagram asking someone to identify the person, that generated the descriptions of the Ozark Trail backpack, the mask, the gloves, the holstered handgun. That footage was obtained by the FBI through a direct outreach to Google. Kash Patel said it explicitly. "I personally called leaders at Google. That is why we have that image. The FBI worked with Google to get it. We could have gotten it days earlier. Let that land." The most important piece of visual evidence in the case, the footage that defined the suspect in the public consciousness and gave investigators the clearest possible look at the person who took Nancy, was obtained through a federal agency's relationship with a private technology company. Not through standard evidence processing, through a phone call that the FBI director made personally. That call could have been made on February 1st. It could have been made on February 2nd. The FBI had both the relationship and the institutional authority to make it on the first day the case was opened. Instead, it was made after 4 days of the agency being kept on the sidelines, and the footage was not released publicly until February 10th. 9 days after the abduction. 9 days before the public saw what the suspect looked like. 9 days before the image went viral. 9 days before 40,000 tips started flowing into the investigation. Tips that included sightings, identifications of the backpack, recognitions of the clothing style, and everything else that a massive public information deployment generates when it has a clear target to focus on. What could have been generated in the first 48 hours was instead generated starting on day 9. That is the cost of the 4-day delay in a single, concrete, measurable dimension. And there is more. Because the FBI's involvement also accelerated the evidence release strategy in another critical area. The images and video that Patel released on February 10th, the first formal, coordinated, nationally amplified suspect imagery in the case, were not just the doorbell footage. They were a package, multiple still images, 2 video clips, and a formal FBI statement identifying the subject as armed, potentially dangerous, and described in specific physical terms. That kind of coordinated release, the kind that triggers national news coverage, social media amplification, and the specific public engagement that can generate the identifying lead in a case like this, is an FBI capability. It requires the institutional infrastructure, the media relationships, the press release architecture, and the credibility that comes from the federal agency's national profile. A county sheriff's department, however competent, does not have that infrastructure at the same scale. So every day the FBI was not fully operational was a day that infrastructure was sitting idle while an 84-year-old woman was missing with failing medication supplies and a pacemaker that needed monitoring. Now here is where the story gets even more layered. Because the 4-day exclusion is only the beginning of the institutional dysfunction that played out in this case. The FBI director going public with his criticism in May, 3 months after the abduction, was not a spontaneous decision. It was the culmination of a months-long friction that had been building quietly inside the investigation, and had finally reached the point where the normal channels of internal correction were not producing results. Reuters had reported in February, months before Patel's public remarks, that the FBI had been blocked from accessing key evidence. That story was significant because Reuters does not publish sourced reports of that nature without substantial internal sourcing. Someone inside the investigation, someone with direct knowledge of the evidence access situation, felt strongly enough about what was happening to go to a national news organization and say, "This is not functioning the way it should." That kind of leak in law enforcement circles is almost always a last resort. Internal disagreements in investigations are handled internally first. They go up the chain of command. They go through official liaison channels between agencies. They generate formal requests and formal responses. Before someone talks to Reuters, they have almost certainly tried every official mechanism available and found it insufficient. The Reuters story was in February. Patel's public remarks were in May. That 3-month gap is not a gap of inactivity. It is a gap during which the investigation continued, the public waited, the family appealed, and the institutional friction that Reuters had identified in February apparently did not resolve itself through internal channels to the FBI director's satisfaction. When Patel chose Sean Hannity's podcast as the venue for his public criticism, the choice of platform was deliberate. Hannity has the largest conservative media audience in the country. A statement made on that platform reaches a specific and massive American audience, an audience that includes the political figures, the voters, and the institutional stakeholders who have the ability to create external pressure on a county sheriff in a way that the FBI's internal channels cannot. This was a pressure campaign, conducted publicly through media because the normal routes of correction had not worked in 3 months. And the sheriff responded. He released a statement. He said he was committed. He said his department had been collaborating with the FBI throughout. He did not concede the specific claim that evidence access had been restricted for 4 days. He framed the relationship as fundamentally collaborative, and the Patel criticism as an inaccurate characterization of events. And here's where the public is left with an uncomfortable question that has never been fully resolved. Whose account is more accurate? The FBI director, appointed to lead the most powerful domestic law enforcement agency in the country, speaking from a position of institutional authority, with access to the case's full internal timeline, says 4 days, kept out, and we would have had the DNA analyzed within days. The sheriff, an elected official managing a high-profile case in his own jurisdiction, speaking from a position of legal authority and political accountability, says his team engaged the FBI the night Nancy disappeared and has maintained a collaborative relationship throughout. Both cannot be fully correct. And the public, without access to the internal communications, the evidence access logs, and the interagency correspondence that would resolve the dispute definitively, is left to assess the credibility of each account through the lens of the outcomes. The outcomes are, the doorbell footage was not obtained until days after the abduction, when the FBI made a personal call to Google that it says it could have made earlier. The DNA results were not public until day 16. When the FBI says it would have had them within days of being given access. The case reached the 100-day mark without a public arrest, and the FBI director felt compelled to go on the most listened-to conservative media podcast in America and name the specific local agency that he says cost his organization 4 critical days. Those outcomes are not consistent with an investigation that was seamlessly collaborative from the beginning. They are consistent with an investigation that experienced the specific kind of institutional friction that both Reuters and an internal sergeant identified months before the director made his public statement. Now let's talk about something that the coverage of this institutional conflict has largely glossed over. The specific claim Patel made about DNA handling. Because of all the things the FBI director said, this is the one that carries the most operational weight for where the case currently stands. He said, "We would have analyzed it within days." He was almost certainly referring to the FBI's forensic laboratory in Quantico, Virginia. one of the most advanced criminal forensic facilities in the world, with capabilities that no state or county agency can replicate. The FBI lab can process DNA evidence using techniques that go beyond the standard CODIS comparison. It can handle degraded samples, partial profiles, and mixed profiles in ways that require specialized technology and specialized personnel. But here is the dimension of that statement that most analysis missed. The FBI director was not just talking about how quickly the lab could run a CODIS comparison. He was talking about the full spectrum of what the FBI's forensic capability can bring to a DNA profile, including the transition from a CODIS no-match to the next phase of the DNA investigation. Because in 2026, a CODIS no-match is not the end of the DNA story. It is the beginning of a different chapter. The chapter that involves investigative genetic genealogy, the technique that uses consumer ancestry databases to build a family tree backward from an unknown DNA profile, arriving at a candidate through biological relatives rather than the suspect's own criminal history. The FBI has worked with private labs, including Othram, the Texas-based forensic genomics laboratory that processed DNA in the Moscow, Idaho case and helped produce an arrest in 3 weeks, to deploy IgG in cases where CODIS comes back empty. And the FBI director's claim that the agency would have had the DNA analyzed within days of access is most meaningfully understood in that context. Not just a faster CODIS result, but a faster entry into the IgG pipeline that gives a no-match result its next move. If the 4-day delay pushed the DNA evidence processing back by days, and if those days pushed the CODIS result from early February to February 17th, then the IgG phase of the investigation, which should logically follow immediately from a no-match CODIS result, was also pushed back by the same delay. That means the most powerful DNA identification tool available, the technology that can build a suspect's identity from a distant cousin's ancestry test, may have entered this investigation weeks later than it could have, would have, and should have. And nobody outside the investigation knows whether IgG is currently active. The reason investigators would not announce that publicly is legitimate. An active IgG investigation, if announced, could alert the suspect's relatives that law enforcement is building a family tree in their direction. But the absence of public confirmation means there is no way to know whether the most powerful available tool is running or whether the case is effectively stalled at the CODIS result that was public knowledge in mid-February. That uncertainty, that gap between what the evidence could support and what the investigation publicly appears to have done with it, is exactly why the FBI director's words should terrify everyone. Not because the case is hopeless. It is not hopeless. The DNA is still viable. IgG is available. Private labs like Othram are reachable. The Cold Case Foundation exists. The FBI is involved. The reward is over $1 million. The public attention is still substantial. But because the 4 days the FBI was kept out of this investigation were not just lost time, they were the most valuable time. The first 48 hours, maximum forensic opportunity, suspect trail still warm, ransom communications actively arriving time. And those 4 days, by the director of the FBI's own account, were spent in a jurisdictional standoff rather than in the full resource, maximum force investigation that an 84-year-old woman in medical jeopardy required. Let's put a human face on what 4 days means. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She has a pacemaker. Her pacemaker connects to a monitoring app on her phone. That app lost connection to her phone line approximately 30 minutes after the doorbell camera disconnected on February 1st at approximately 2:15 a.m. That means that within 30 minutes of whatever happened at that front door, the medical monitoring system that was her most direct health lifeline went dark. She was also dependent on critical daily medication, the specific nature of which was not fully disclosed publicly, but which her family and investigators repeatedly described as life-sustaining and as one of the primary urgency factors in the search. Every day without that medication was a day that increased the medical risk to a woman whose baseline health situation was already fragile. Day 1, Day 2, Day 3, Day 4. While the FBI was kept out, while the evidence access was restricted, while the forensic window was closing, while the suspect's trail was aging, Nancy Guthrie was wherever she was, without her medication, without her medical monitoring, without the full weight of the most powerful law enforcement agency in the world working on finding her with the access it needed. That is what terrifies everyone. Not an abstract institutional disagreement, not a bureaucratic turf war between agencies, a specific human being in specific medical jeopardy whose best chance at being found quickly depended on the FBI being fully operational from hour one, and who, by the director's own account, was not afforded that. Now let's talk about what happened after the FBI was let in. Because Patel's statement, "Look what we did," is not just self-congratulation. It is evidence of what was possible, and it makes the 4-day delay even harder to accept in retrospect. Once the FBI had full operational engagement, the doorbell footage came out. The suspect imagery went national. The backpack was identified. The glove was found and tested. The DNA profile was established. The reward was amplified through federal channels. And 40,000 tips started flowing in. 40,000 tips. That is the public response when a nationally amplified investigation releases a suspect image with the full credibility and reach of FBI involvement behind it. 40,000 pieces of public information that may contain, somewhere in their volume, the identifying detail that eventually names the masked man in the backpack. What if that release had happened on February 3rd instead of February 10th? What if the 40,000 tips had started flowing a week earlier, while the trail was a week fresher? What if the DNA results had come within days of the FBI getting access, as the director said they could have, and the no match had been established in early February rather than mid-February, giving investigators an extra 2 weeks to begin the IgG phase of the DNA investigation before the case reached its 100-day mark with no public resolution? Those are not rhetorical questions with no answers. They are counterfactual questions that point to a specific, documented, consequential institutional failure in the earliest days of a case where every hour mattered, and where, by the FBI director's own words, hours were lost that did not need to be. And that is the terrifying thing. Not that the case is impossible to solve, not that the evidence is gone, not that the system has completely failed, but that the system failed at the moment it was most needed, in the first 4 days, and that the person who sits at the top of the federal agency that should have been there says so directly, publicly, and on the record. There is a version of this case where the FBI walked into the Catalina foothills on February 1st and had full operational access from the first hour. Where the Google call was made on February 1st and the suspect footage was public by February 3rd. Where the DNA was in the FBI lab by February 2nd and the CODIS result was back by February 5th, and the IgG investigation was initiated by February 7th, where 40,000 tips started flowing 2 weeks earlier than they did. There is a version of this case where all of that happened, and in that version, the case may have looked very different by the 100-day mark. We will never know for certain. Counterfactuals are not guarantees. Even with perfect early-stage investigative execution, complex premeditated abductions take time to solve. The suspect was careful. The evidence, though substantial, is not simple. The DNA required laboratory work that could not be rushed beyond its biological limits. But we know this. The version we got was not that version. The version we got was 4 days out. And the person who says so is not a reporter, not a former investigator with an axe to grind, not a social media account building theories at 2 in the morning. It is the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And when the director of the FBI says, publicly, that 4 critical days were lost in the investigation of a missing 84-year-old woman, and that his agency would have had the DNA analyzed within days if it had been given access, the appropriate response is not to move past it, not to treat it as one more headline in a case that generates a new headline every week. The appropriate response is to stop, sit with it, and ask the question that the director's statement demands. What happened in those 4 days? What evidence existed in that window that was not collected at full federal capability? What forensic opportunities existed in the crime scene during those 4 days that were not maximized by a county sheriff's department working without the FBI's laboratory and behavioral analysis resources? What did the suspect do during those 4 days that might have been traceable with full FBI operational engagement, and is no longer traceable because that window has closed? We do not have complete answers to those questions. They exist, in full detail, inside an investigation that is not publicly disclosed. But the fact that the FBI director went on record, voluntarily, specifically, by name, to identify the institutional failure that cost his agency 4 days in this case, suggests that the answers, if they were fully public, would be significant. That is what terrifies everyone. Not the known, the unknown that the known implies. The masked man in the backpack is still unidentified publicly. The DNA is still producing no public CODIS match. The case is still open, and the 4 days that the director says were lost are permanently part of this investigation's history. A gap that exists, that was documented, and that the most senior law enforcement official in the country has now placed on the record as a failure that cost critical time in the search for a missing woman who needed all the time she could get. If there is a resolution to this case, and there may still be, it will come despite those 4 days, not because of them. And if there is never a resolution, if this case joins the 250,000 unsolved serious crimes in this country that John Ramsey described when he was talking about the same institutional dysfunction, then those 4 days will always be part of the accounting, not as a theory, not as speculation. As the FBI director's own words, preserved in a podcast interview, sitting in the public record long after whatever happens next in the Nancy Guthrie case, 4 days kept out. The first 48 hours are the most critical. Say it slowly. Let each sentence do its work, and then decide whether you are terrified, because you should be. Subscribe to Guthrie Records, like this video, and leave a comment with one word that describes how you feel about the fact that the FBI director is the one who told us this. Not a leak, not an anonymous source, the director himself. One word, drop it below, and we will keep following this case until the answers finally come.